All right, well, let's draw some more trees. These are the ones we worked on last time. So if you haven't seen that video, I'd recommend checking it out. But today we're going to be moving on to some more complicated trees using conglomerate shapes. And this very simply is just going to be multiple basic three-dimensional shapes laid upon one another, which is going to give you a better, more accurate representation of what a tree might look like. So let's go ahead and get started. The first one I'm going to work on is going to be pretty basic, as the ones we started with last time, and I think are just generally a good thing to start with, is a sphere. So let's go ahead and take several of these and layer them on one another and just see what we get. Okay, I'm going to start with something pretty basic like this. I'm going to give myself my trunk, make sure my branches are not parallel one another, and that little sketch should be just enough to get us started. If you can't see the sketch very well, don't worry about it. This will very quickly get it into place, and you don't really need to have a sketch. It's a little bit of a safety net. It helps you work out some issues as you get started. So the big thing to think about here is the fact that each of these represents a large shape in our canopy of our tree. And as such, they're going to cast shadows and catch light in different ways. I'm going to start by going around the exterior, as I generally do. Give myself a little bit of a broken line here because, the foliage on the top of a tree is not perfect. I am going to actually curve back in here. I'm assuming that this large chunk here is actually overhanging the chunk beneath it. And when we get down to this, I'm going to break it up in a slightly different way as well, because I'm assuming this shape is in front of that other shape. Now, I talked about this last time, and I'll re-echo it here. When you are working with shapes on a tree, generally the bottom of them is less precise. You'll get the top that is kind of this more accurate shape. As you get towards the bottom, you get things like this, where the shape will actually break up a little bit. So I'm going to curve that back in. Going to take this back over on our shape here. And you might be looking at this and going, that's a pretty funky looking thing, but honestly, a lot of trees are a little bit strange. So I'm going to do just a moment here of getting some of our branches in. I'm not going to worry too much about this. Just trying to get myself in the right place, so as we start moving through it, I know what I'm doing. And sometimes just getting your shapes and your trunk in will show you some things. Like right now I can see that there should probably be a little bit more over here, but I think I'm going to keep this tree just kind of goofy because this is the shape that I started with. Not everything ends up perfect when you do these kinds of drawings. So let's go ahead and start working in our leaves. I'm going to start here along the top. I'm doing little marks like this to indicate leaves because this is a deciduous tree, a tree that loses its leaves. There's going to be more of those marks as we move down the individual sphere because it's going to have more shadow. And indeed, there'll be little spots like I'll do right here where you actually would see into the tree. When you get to the bottom of each of these spheres, it's obviously going to be quite a bit darker, and then it will actually cast its shadow down on the shape underneath it. So I'm going to use hatching to show that. I like differentiating my marks. I'm using one kind of mark to indicate leaves, and then I'll use a different kind of mark to indicate shadow. You don't have to do that. You could, in fact, just layer a whole bunch of the leaf marks, and that would make it look as if it was shadowed. And maybe you prefer that technique. I'm just going to go around the edge here and try to get more of our leaf forms in. But you can see already it's starting to look like something. It's starting to look like a tree. Maybe a tree that had a power line running right there and needed to have part of it get removed. So on the edges, I will often put in more marks because at the edge of a surface like this, especially a surface where you see through portions of it, it will appear darker often. Not always, but you will find with most nature-oriented things that always is just not a particular good term to use. There are not a lot of things that are always when it comes to trees, when it comes to plants, when it comes to animals. You might notice too that I bounce around a lot while I'm drawing. This is particularly because while I'm making a set of marks, I'm not always looking exactly where I'm making the mark. Sometimes my eyes are looking to the next place I'm going to make a mark, and sometimes in doing that, I will find something that needs to be filled in. I'm doing another little dark bit right here to indicate that there's some shadow. Maybe I'll make it a little bit darker actually and make it look as if this whole chunk is overhanging. Again, I'll leave that bottom lighter because the light is going to come through from the side or from the back and hit that a little bit. I'm going to go up and make a little bit more of these kind of random leaf overhang marks there. We'll come back over to this kind of final segment here and get some more leaves in there. Leaves, not leaves. Sometimes it's hard to chat and talk while you're doing things like this because I'm trying to think about all the different pieces that I'm doing and then what I'm doing that I don't remember that I'm doing or think about because I've been at this for a while. So you can see right off the bat, it's kind of a goofy looking tree, but it kind of makes sense. These chunks are flowing into one another. They feel as if they're existing in the same space. You know, this one's casting a shadow on the one below it. Probably honestly casting a little shadow down here on this one as well. We've got a dark space here. We could even kind of fill this in a little bit as if there's even more dark back there. And sometimes you don't have to use hatching. You can just kind of color it in. So that works. I'm going to go ahead and darken in these branches, assuming that they're getting a lot of cast shadow work from what's right above them. Then I'm going to go proceed with some hatching to give me the illusion of that bark heading down. And we have a pretty simple, pretty straightforward tree. I like putting the grass on the bottom. It just makes it feel more like it's involved in an environment, like it belongs there. Now, if I really wanted to make this one a little bit more accurate, I would probably come in here and I would expand that out, and I probably would have noticed that on the sketch. It's not important for this because I'm just kind of showing the technique, but just in case you got to a similar place, there's nothing wrong with going in and modifying it again. That's part of the reason why we work with the pencil at the beginning, because that can help us avoid some things that might be a little bit awkward. Well, let's try another one of these. Let's try something a little bit different. Maybe this time we won't start with a large central one. We'll just start with a couple, chunks like this and see what happens. I'm actually going to do a little one up here that's kind of separated and maybe a little one down there. I did that, but I probably won't do it. And then let's make the trunk on this one not entirely straight. So let's kind of start with something like this. Because you know what? That's actually how it's going to be sometimes. You're not going to end up with trunks that are always exactly the same. They're not always going to make perfect sense from a graphing or linear standpoint. So let's try this guy. Let's see what happens here. I'm going to start again the same way, just going around my edge. I'm going to try to make the foliage on this one a little bit different, maybe droopy, more like a willow, but not entirely. So I'm going to bring this down. I'm assuming this top chunk is kind of in the forefront. This back chunk is going to be the furthest back, so this is going to be like the closest, then that one, then that one. So instead of just going straight off, I'm going to allow my foliage to kind of slope a little bit here around the edge, and we'll get something like that. And then we'll do the same thing over here, where the foliage is kind of a little droopy. I haven't done this before, so we will see how this works. I try to prep these things ahead of time, and pretty much always do. I've got a sheet of sketches here that are my ideas and things I want to make sure I cover. But there's nothing wrong with trying something new out. You never know if you're going to come up with something that is kind of exciting and different. And I would encourage you, don't be married to the way you've always done a thing, because sometimes you will uncover very fun things that are new if you just give yourself the ability to fail, the permission to fail. After all, failure is a very complicated topic when it comes to art, but in a lot of ways, the only failure here is if you don't progress, if you don't allow yourself to make things. And that is tragic because art is such a wonderful, freeing thing. And if you can give yourself the ability to actually sit down and make things and the freedom to make bad things, then you're going to be less afraid. You're going to be more apt to try new things and to come up with some really cool ideas. So I'm going to be using leaf type marks like I did on the prior one up here kind of at the top. But as we get to the bottom of each of these shapes, I'm going to see if I can kind of change those lines into more straight lines. And we'll see what it looks like. It's already looking a little bit more like a Dr. Seussian kind of tree. And I'm using pens for this. A lot of the work that I do here on the channel and in general is pen oriented, but it doesn't have to be. You could totally do this with a pencil. All of these marks that I'm doing right now, you could do as individual marks, or you could do them as shading. It wouldn't be that big a deal to, shade in these dark little areas and make it look exactly the same as this, or, a little bit different because it is a different medium. It would not be that big a deal. In fact, if you were going to do that, like I've got a mechanical pencil right here. So if you had something like this, let's make sure we're on the frame. If you had something like this, I would probably start by shading in big areas like this. Get myself some subtle gradients up to where the highlights were. But then I would still come back in, just like I'm doing right now, and give myself some, darker areas. And over time, I would be working in those same kind of marks that would give me that manner of texture. All right, let's move back to our regularly scheduled program here. I'm unsure if these line textures feel like they're just shading like this or otherwise, but I'm not going to know unless I try it. So I'm going to keep going with it. I kind of like the way that this is looking. It already feels kind of like a swamp tree. Now, as I'm doing the shading here of where this top section is overlapping, I'm trying to make sure that my lines are following the contour, the roll of the shapes beneath it. I could have just made those marks in any direction, and that probably would have been okay. But when you have a shape, it's good to shade along the side of that. You call that contour shading or cross contour if you're going perpendicular to it. So this seems to be working all right. I wonder if we can do like some weird fruit things hanging here. That might be kind of fun. After all, there are a lot of different cool kinds of trees in our world. And if you're anything like me and you like world building, you like building other things, then sometimes it's fun to see what other kind of things you can come up with. Maybe this is a tree that's going to fit into a story you're telling. Maybe your campaign for D&D or Pathfinder. And those kind of things are really fun. So there's a lot of places that art can come in your life where it's just going to make life better. I find that it's often a very personal thing for most artists, and for me too. But there's also a lot of really cool stuff that can be done that can be shared with others. I was doing a D&D campaign a couple years back now, and I remember at one point one of my friends got a cool magic sword. And I had the idea of, well, I've been getting back into digital art. I'll go ahead and, draw out what this blade looks like for him. And I did, and that was a really cool thing. He was appreciative of it, and it was just another fun aspect for him when he was looking at that weapon in his stat sheet in the subsequent episodes. It was, there's an actual little thing, a physical artifact, a little visual reminder of what this thing looks like. And those kind of things are cool. Sometimes it's not quite that practical. Sometimes it's just a funny thing that makes you laugh. But art doesn't have to be sophisticated. All right, so I've kind of finished off these sections. I'm going to come down. I was struggling a little bit on this center part. I think maybe it needs to be a little bit darker. Have some of the one above it cast some more shadows down. I'm going to come down to this little separate chunk. And the reason I did these two is because this happens a lot. As much as we want trees when we're drawing them to be these really simple things, they're often not. They often have very complicated foliage patterns. I'm going to shade the trunk up here, and then as I come down, I'm a little bit looser on these marks because the texture on the trunk's going to presumably be a little bit larger. So we're down here at the bottom. Let's give ourselves some grass, and maybe we'll do a little rock here that's grown. The rock's grown. A little rock that's positioned right next to the bottom of our tree. So you can see that one's a little bit different. We've got the conglomerate shapes are still helping us kind of put everything together. But this is another good strategy for making a tree like this. So let's go on and do, I think we'll do one more here that's going to be recognizable and a little bit different. This is going to be more of a kind of traditional pine tree. A lot of times when we look at pine trees, I think we expect them to be like we in the US would call a Christmas tree, where it's very much just a, here, we'll go over here real quick, where it'd be like this, and, it's shaded like a cone. A lot of pine trees are not built like that. They actually have rows of branches. So we're gonna try to approximate that here. And the way that I'm gonna do that is I'm gonna actually separate out the tree with these lines, and each of these lines are gonna represent branches that are coming out pretty straight from the trunk. And that's how we're gonna do it. So I'm thinking and talking and drawing at the same time. So let's go ahead and just start, and I'll show you what I mean. And I would encourage you to draw along with me. This is all done in real time so that you can follow along. You can make sure you're picking up what you want to pick up. You don't obviously have to draw exactly what I'm drawing. That would be very boring. But I offer that as a possibility just in case. So these lines here are just the idea that you can see part of the trunk even though the branches are going to be in front of it. This kind of tree, I find this is effective. Because I have a sketch, you don't have to do it now, but I chose to do it now. So as this goes down, the trunk up here obviously is going to be very, very thin. We're going to go out here, and we're assuming that these are pine needles that are falling off not falling off, but being held on that little wayward branch. And again, like we talked about in the last episode of this, your branches are not all going to be parallel. So some are going to go out further than others. And some are going to be a little bit shorter. Some are going to come out at weird angles. Some are going to approximate coming out toward us as the viewer. In fact, right here, I'll do one like that. You can see right away that these branches are coming off at different angles. And you're actually going to end up with some branches, like I'll do one right here, that is underneath the branch above it. And so this branch is going to be pretty much totally shaded. And if you look at trees, this happens a lot. You end up with trees that have some bizarre patterns when you look at the colors and the shading, and that is because some of those branches are catching the light really well, some of them are not, some of them are totally in shadow, and so you will get some very bizarre lights and darks as you look into the tree. But you can see these branches are very, very different than the ones that we were working on prior, and yet the structure of the tree is still very much the same. You're going to go down here. On this one, we're actually going to do some branches that look as if they are parallel. And the reason I'm changing this is I'm just varying it so you can see there's, as long as you're thinking about what you're doing, as long as you're being thoughtful and considerate about how you put your marks down, it's kind of hard to mess up. Like this one, none of the marks went to the top of the branch. Over here, I'll do a couple batches where they do, and you'll see that that's totally fine too. It just implies a different thing. This one implies that it's getting a lot of light there on the top, and maybe that there's not a lot of texture that's going right up toward the branch itself. This one is a little bit different, but still functions just fine. Because that one's mostly parallel, I want to make sure that the one underneath it is not. So I'm going to kind of come out here and give myself a big shape like that. This one I'm actually going to go down lower and come a little bit in front of the branch. So we're going to have a little bit of extraneous fingers and branch coming off that way. It's a hard thing to remember, and it took me a long time when I was learning to draw trees and just learning how to put some basic things together like that, is branches come towards us too. And that's obvious, right? It makes a ton of sense, and yet it's something that's so easy to miss when you're drawing something fundamental like a tree. So, and in fact, like I mentioned earlier, this is going to be a branch that just comes straight towards us, so we're going to see a ton of these needles in front here. And you can see this is pretty messy in a lot of ways, and yet it kind of functions just fine. So much of this is just understanding how a tree is put together. This branch obviously is overshadowed by the one above it, so it's just much darker. And I'm going to do a really thin one back here that's maybe going away from us, and that's why it looks that way. The trunk is also getting thicker as we're going down. That's how she goes. Another branch coming out pretty far here. We'll do another one there, and maybe a little bit of a dark portion that comes out here. And a lot of these trees, especially in Colorado, where I'm from, will often not have branches very close to the ground. I think sometimes this is creatures like elk who run into them, moose who actually eat the pine needles, if I'm not mistaken. and then a lot of times they're in competition with other plants in their early years. And so the branches at the bottom are not going to catch that much light, and so they just don't exist. And sometimes that can help when you're thinking about a tree and why a tree grows the way it does, why a tree does the things it does, is they are trying to get as much water as they can, as much nutrients as they can, and they are trying to get as much sun. And so a tree is going to grow in a way that's going to afford it those things. So if branches on a particular side of the tree don't make sense because it's up against a cliff face or it would always be in shadow, then there's not going to be any branches there. Trees are a logical thing, like most of the natural world. All right, well, this has been 3 kind of conglomerate shaped trees is what I'm calling these at this moment. It's taking complicated shapes and overlapping them, thinking about how the shadows function, where you get individual segments laying down over others, where you get branches, entire branching structures that are under others. But this hopefully has been helpful to you. And as always, thank you for being here. Thanks for watching and listening. Please let me know in the comments below what you'd like me to see, what you'd like to see me cover in upcoming videos. And let me know which part of this was most helpful for you. It's really beneficial to me as I'm looking through things later and knowing which way to move forward. Thank you to my patrons who are on the screen now. And if you want to check out our Discord server, which is totally free, and it's just a nice little artistic community where you can work on things like this, get feedback on your art, and just talk to other people, sometimes even just rant about the things that we endure as artists, there's a link to that in the description down below. Well, have a good one, y'all. See you soon.